Wait till Gail sits down. Both Steve and Diane are sick, I'm told.
They are moving.
Oh, they're moving. Okay. Okay. And Carolyn and Colita are at some VFW thingy bob. Oh. We'll wait for them. Everybody else is here. All right. So, here we go. You have in front of you an outline. Let me point out just a few things before we get started. The first 8 or 9 pages, let's see, 7 pages, are going to be introduction, which I'm going to go through, not word for word, but paragraph by paragraph or so. Okay. Starting on page 8, which we probably will not get to today, you have the outline, and I just tried to keep it as simple as possible, so I just numbered them. So they go from 1 all the way to the last page, which is 150. So what I did is divided the life and ministry of Jesus up into 150 sections. And then I put the sections of the 4 Gospels, I put the sections together to talk on the same event. Right? So that's why you'll see, for example, if you look on page 8, go down, look at number 2, for example, genealogy of Jesus. And so you have Matthew 1, 1 to 17, and Luke 3, 23 to 28. So it's the same material, basically, or in general, but covered in 2 different ways by 2 different gospel writers. Matthew, probably the first gospel, and Luke, the third gospel. Some people like to put Mark as the first gospel, but frankly, I think that's dubious. If you turn to page 9, let's see, no, not yet. Okay, keep going, page 10. Okay, yeah, page 10. Top of the page, number 13. You'll see Matthew 3, Mark 1, Luke 3. Underneath that, you'll see Matthew 4, Mark 1, Luke 4, and so on and so forth. And so quite often you'll see 3 gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then other times you'll see just John. Once in a very long while you'll see Luke and John or Matthew and Mark, but most of the time it'll be the first three and then John, and very rarely, I think once or twice, you'll see all 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay? What we are going to do is this, and again, we won't get probably to even the first one in John today, but what we're going to do is this. I'm going to ask you to read on your own, in your own time, during the week, 2 weeks in between classes, the material in parentheses for certain numbers. Sometimes I'll give you 2 numbers or 3 numbers, like 13 to 15 or something like that. Other times, if it's a real long section, I'll just give you 1. All right? So that's the first thing. You're going to have to do some work on your own. Secondly, first thing we're going to do then when we get together here is I'm going to ask you for your questions on those sections that I assigned to you. So if you ran up against something there and you want to know more about it, whether it's historical, theological, whichever, ask away. Then I'm going to give you anywhere from 3 to 5 points or notes. And I've left room in there for you to put down. You don't have to put them all down, put ones down that interest you. And I'll write some of them on the board as we go along. And we can discuss those. And then we're going to keep track of our work by making a check mark or an X or something in the little boxes way off there to your right. So we're not going to move on until everybody's satisfied that you understand that section, okay, that event or parable or story or whatever it is, okay, miracle, whatever, okay? Once we're all satisfied that we're confident, we understand everything there, we don't have any more questions, make a check mark, move on. Okay? Everybody got it down?
Yes.
All right. So today, and probably the next session too, we're going to be talking about the life and times, and basically the times, the historical context of Jesus' life and ministry. What was going, or you could put it this way, what in the world was happening when Jesus made his appearance in the world? Okay? And it is important to know this. If you remember back a few years ago when we were going through the books of the Bible, we stopped, as you remember, between Malachi and Matthew, and we talked a little bit, one session at least, about the Greeks and the Syrians and the Egyptians and all that. Okay? This time we're going to concentrate mostly on just Palestine, mostly on just Israel itself, okay? And mostly on Judah and Jerusalem. Because Jesus spends a great deal of time in Judah and Jerusalem. The other time he spends in Galilee, but there's really not a whole lot to say about Galilee. Galilee, except to say that it was a backwater. It was the ghetto. That's it. That's all you need to know, really. And I will make some other comments about Galilee, but basically we're going to talk a lot about Jerusalem. Jerusalem is really the focus, because this is where Jesus dies. This is where Jesus has to go to die. This is the focus of his enemies. This is the home. This is home base for his enemies, both the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the scribes and the rabbis and so on and so. This is their home base. This is also one of the capitals for the Roman occupation. Caesarea is the actual capital of the Roman province of Judea, but Jerusalem is still very, very important. So important that there was a big Roman fort there, and there was a large contingent of Roman soldiers stationed there 24/7, 365. So, with that said, let's move right into it and talk first about the people. What kind of people are we talking about when we talk about the people of Israel that Jesus had dealt with? Well, first of all, everything centers around the royal court. Everything centers around the royal court and the temple. That first paragraph, for example, the splendor of the royal court. We don't think of that very often because we think of Jerusalem and Judea as poor. The movies show us a kind of sad representation of the glory of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was one of the most magnificent cities in the ancient world. And the temple was one of the marvels of the ancient world. You don't get that from watching movies about Jesus. You really don't. I've looked back on them. I've gone on the internet and looked up various portions of them. They really don't give you much of an idea of how glorious this temple was. True, it was not as glorious, at least in the beginning, as Solomon's temple. But Herod did a good job of making it a massive public works program. When you think of Jerusalem in the days of Jesus, think of Washington, D.C. And think of maybe the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, maybe the Washington Memorial or the Capitol, the White House, all combined in the temple. The temple was that glorious. The palace where the Herod lived was that glorious. was magnificent. The fortress that the Romans inhabited was massive. Matter of fact, it was taller than the temple. It looked down on the temple. Right? So you don't get that from books and magazines and newspaper articles and things like that. You really don't. It's sad, but it's true. Cousins of the king, as I say there, and other relatives were favored by living in royal apartments. The palace and around the palace were all of these, we would call them condos or townhouses, where all the cousins and nephews and nieces and friends and associates and hangers-ons would all gather. Kind of like you've seen the last couple of weeks in London and around England, where these royal residences, Buckingham Palace with 148 apartments, and the castle in Windsor with 100 and some odd rooms and bedrooms, and the castle up in Balmoral, with I think 70, 80 rooms, and so on and so forth. So, and you have many people living there. You have many of the shirt-tail relations of the royals living there. It's the same way in Jerusalem. And so there were a lot of these people. And they were very rich. The lifestyle was basically what we would call Oriental, as can be seen by many harems. And the fact that the Sanhedrin allowed as many as 18 wives. So in these apartments, you would have maybe one apartment for the husband or the head of the house, and then you would have a harem, which could be a very large room where all the wives slept. Or maybe you would have 2 or 3 rooms for various age groups of the wives or something like that. The Jews were not what we would call the most moral people in the world. They had a lot of leeway, or were given a lot of leeway by the priests and the rabbis in their personal relationships, and they ran with it, as we'll talk about more as we go along. Yeah. Life at court was paid for by taxing revenues and mining. So the Sanhedrin owned mines. They owned flocks. They owned herds. They owned ships. They were quite wealthy. They lived off the taxes of the people. Again, just as the royals in England do. What pays for Harry and William to do what they do and go where they go and have what they have? Taxes. Taxes on the people. Right? They pay for it. Okay? A wealthy segment of society was extravagant. In other words, the 1%ers, we would call them, or the 1 and 2%ers perhaps, they lived very opulently. In other words, you could tell who these people were. You didn't have to guess. This is evidenced by their excessive income. There was a good deal of polygamy in the wealthy families, which was expensive. They had to keep these wives happy. You have a hard time keeping one wife happy? Imagine keeping 18 or 20 happy, okay? And the aristocratic women were very pampered. They were given everything, though they had few actual rights. They really didn't have any kind of rights as we would know them today, but they lived in luxury. The most prominent representatives of this rich class were the members of the Sanhedrin, or Sanhedrin, some people pronounce it. The priestly aristocracy, people like Caiaphas and Annas. One priest carpeted the way from the front door of his home to the temple, so his wife could walk on it to the services rather than walk in the dirty streets. This was, 1,000 yards, something like that. Carpeted. And he had guards to make sure nobody else walked on this carpet except his wife. The servants had to walk in the dust of the streets. His wife got to walk on the carpet, 1,000 yards from his house to the temple.
How many did he have to clean the carpet?
I have no idea. Another man, and we know his name, Eliezer ben Harsum, he owned outright 1,000 villages throughout Israel and ships. He owned the villages. This is the villages, in other words, had at some time or other given over all their property, during a famine maybe, or during a disease, a plague or something like that. They needed help. And so he would buy them up cheap and give them enough money so that they could survive. This was common. The Herodian era villas, unearthed in the Jewish court of the Old City, is a good window into the tremendous wealth of the priestly families. These remains, discovered in the building of this section of the city, preserve a lifestyle that ranked with the best of classical Roman Greece. Mosaic floors, ritual baths, regular bathtubs, reception halls, frescoes, imported Italian pottery, and the like. In other words, when they were rebuilding Jerusalem at various times during history, they would dig down and they would find these various things. And like I said, it equaled anything you would find in Athens or Rome. Very opulent, very luxurious, very extravagant. Okay, remember that these mosaics and this pottery and paintings were very expensive. You had to pay artists. You had to pay for their time. You had to pay for their material. And this was a luxurious item that very few people had going on. The middle class, on the other hand, were mostly the merchants, the retail traders, the innkeepers, and tavern owners. They did their best business with the temple trade and with the pilgrims. The law of Judea dictated that up to 1/10 of one's income had to be spent in Jerusalem at the festivals. And this was especially true of the rich. So if you took in 100,000 denarii a year, you had to spend 10,000 denarii on the festivals. That meant the merchants got rich, and the traders got rich, and the caravan owners got rich. Okay, the merchants got rich. This is why there were so many of these merchants and stuff inside the temple that Jesus had to run them out not once but twice. Okay? This is also why they hated Jesus, because Jesus wanted to bring an end to the ritual sacrifices. He said the ritual sacrifices were not necessary, that the temple was not necessary. Now, again, they could keep the temple if they wanted, and anybody could make a sacrifice if they wanted to. All Jesus said is, once I've done my work, you don't have to do those things. You can do them if you want to. If it makes you better, fine. But you don't have to. But just because he gave the option, okay, he said, I'm fulfilling the law of Moses for everybody, so that you don't have to fulfill the law of Moses anymore. That, you see, was a threat to the economy of Jerusalem. That was a threat to all the merchants. That was a threat to all the rich people. That was a threat to all the political rulers and the royalty and everything else. It was a threat to them. You know, it would be like King Charles now, King Charles III, going on TV tomorrow, or Monday, let's say, going on TV Monday and said, I'm going, not only am I going to abdicate, but with a stroke of a pen, I'm going to get rid of the monarchy and the entire monarchy system. That's what it would be like. He would put thousands, tens of thousands of people out of business, out of jobs. That's why nobody will ever do that, no matter how much he might want to. So this is what Jesus was up against, folks. Jesus was not only up against work righteousness, on a theological level. He was up against, we would say, I guess today, capitalism. And he was up against the monarchy, and he was up against a combination of church and state. If you noticed, right, when Charles took his vows, when he took his oaths right after Elizabeth died, you remember what he said. He is now the head of the Church of England. There's a complete combination of church and state. They are one and the same thing. Okay? And he also had to promise to keep the Presbyterian Church as the Church of Scotland. Okay, so the Anglican Church is the Church of England and Wales and Northern Ireland, and the Presbyterian Church is the Church of Scotland. He had to promise to do that. and he's the head of the Anglican side. Okay, so what Jesus is up against, he's up against an awful lot. The priests were the next part, and they were part of the middle class for the most part. Their income coming through the animal sacrifices, first fruits, and tithes. So when people brought sacrifices, part of the sacrifices, as you remember from the Old Testament, the fatty parts, the liver and stuff like that, and the fat around the liver and the entrails and things would be burned. And then the what we would call the muscle parts or the meat part would then be given to the Levites. Now, they wouldn't eat it all themselves very often, especially if they lived in Jerusalem. They would have shops where they would sell this to the population. So they became, in effect, kind of the butcher shops of the city. Due to the spiritual malaise of the nations, many priests were poverty-stricken, had to take second jobs. So the Sanhedrin, they live off of the taxes. The priests don't live off the taxes. And there were so many priests that you only had a certain number of days or a certain number of weeks that you would serve in the temple and be able to get this meat and portions of grain and portions of wine and portions of oil. And there was no other support from the state, even though it was a state religion. And so you had to get a second job. You had to take a second job in order to survive. People don't realize that. Again, you know, when Jesus is talking about leaving everything and follow him, and some of the priests, of course, must have gotten the idea in their heads, well, that he means for us to do this. How can we survive? See? So there again, most people don't understand how Jesus and how in his acting and in his preaching scared the ever-loving you-know-what out of the priests. It's like, are we supposed to do this? How are we going to live? How are we going to provide for our wives and kids? Okay. Where was I? Okay, they had to take they had to take second jobs. In fact, the majority of the population were poor, mostly day workers and slaves. Well, there were many more workers than slaves. Slavery was very common throughout Palestine. And of course, we've talked about this before, how common slavery was in Palestine and right up until the modern age. Very, very common. The day workers also included a group called the scribes. Many of them had other sources of income too. Begging was done mostly in and around the holy places. Near the time of the First Jewish War, as you know, ended in 70 AD, started, I think, in 63. The poor often turned to looting and rioting to survive. So if you look around the country here a few years ago, you saw in Portland and Seattle and Minneapolis and various other places, a lot of looting going on. Los Angeles, a lot of looting going on. This is how people basically made their living. And that's exactly the way it was in Jerusalem. If you read the history of Jerusalem, you see public unrest, civilian unrest was incredibly common. The Romans had a hard time keeping a lid on the rioting and other things that were going on at the time. The cost of living was much higher in Jerusalem than the rest of the country. So imagine living, for example, if you here today, instead of getting gas at $3.50 or $4, you're in California paying $5.50 and $6. That's a big difference, isn't it? It's a huge difference. You go to buy chicken or you go to buy bacon, let's say, because I always buy bacon over there. You go to buy bacon, you can get a nice pack of bacon for $5 around here, $6 maybe. In California, San Diego, that's going to cost you $8 or $9. Now, they apply that across the board. That's what it was like living in Jerusalem. And if you got a prophet coming in like Jesus and saying, I'm going to get rid of the temple, and I'm your king, I'm a carpenter and I'm your king, not this guy with all of his royal family, you're going to say, no way, Jose, I'll be out of work. In emergencies, famines and droughts, the price was even higher, and there was a great deal of profiteering. And you all know what profiteering means. Profiteering means you get whatever the market will bear. Okay? So let's say a couple refineries get bombed or blow up, or an earthquake hits them, or a hurricane hits them, and the guy at the gas station down here knows he's not going to be getting a whole lot of gas, maybe for a while. He raises the price right up to $10 or $12 a gallon because he knows he can get it. Because where else are you going to go? No matter where you go, it's going to be the same. That's profiteering. Now, it's supposed to be illegal. I haven't seen anybody prosecuted for that. At least I haven't heard about it and read about it since Second World War. You saw it then, but not much. Next paragraph. The main concerns of the majority of the population were Roman occupation and taxation. So if you did a poll, all right, if you did a poll like we do around here and you ask people, what is your number one concern with the upcoming election? What's on your mind with the upcoming election? If you ask that question in Jerusalem, it would be the Romans. Get rid of the Romans. Okay? And the taxes are too darn high. That's what they would say. Sounds like today, huh? Get rid of the immigrants, and the taxes are too darn high. Same type of thing. The major support for the economy came from the religious festivals and temple. I cannot repeat that strongly enough, folks. Everything in Jerusalem, everybody, one way or another, was tied to the temple and the festivals of the temple and the ongoing sacrifices, the everyday sacrifices at the temple and the special festivals. Everybody. It's like here in Sierra Vista, right? Everything in one way or another, no matter how you cut it, everything is tied to that fort. Everything's tied to the military. Everything's tied to civil service, DOD, government contractors, etc. Even though, like my son, he now works in a civilian section. He is hired by a group out of Chicago, and they don't technically have anything to do with the government. But all the people that work there were all people that are trained and have their security clearance because they worked at one time on the post. That's where they get their workers. Okay? So without the post being here, they wouldn't have workers, the workers wouldn't live here, and there would be nothing here. You know, the mall wouldn't just be empty, it would be bulldozed. Right? So think of that. Think of that everything, everybody, one way or another, even if you're working at McDonald's, you're working at McDonald's because the temple workers, want to go out and have lunch, right? That's why you've got a job at McDonald's. That's why you've got a job at Burger King, is because of the temple workers, which there are thousands of them, okay? So, very important. Still, the average Jew was not what we today would call religious. They were mostly concerned with day-to-day survival and moving up the social structure. Most of the people, when John came to preach and baptize, he was doing something very different than they were used to. They weren't used to thinking spiritually. They weren't used to thinking in religious terms. They didn't care. So when John came and he talked about repentance, and he talked about God as a burning fire, and he talked about the winnowing fork and all that kind of stuff, this really hit the people because they hadn't been thinking in religious terms. This is why he attracted these big crowds, because people, for the first time in their lives, were actually being preached at about their sin and about their need for a Savior. This had never happened in the last 150 years in Jerusalem. They were totally caught up in the world and only the world. So this prophet comes around dressed like a nutcase with his camel hair coat and eating, insects and everything. Wow, just really attracted their attention. Like, wow, this guy's got something to say. Okay. Israel's governance was a mix of plutocracy and theocracy. Plutocracy means rule by the rich. Okay, rule by the rich. That's what we have in this country. Okay? Every single one of the people either in the Senate right now or running for the U.S. Senate are millionaires. Most of them many times over, some of them billionaires. They're not like you. They're not like me. Okay? I mean, it's not unusual for us in the middle class now, for our net worth, if we have a house or something like that, our net worth to be over $1 million. So I'm not talking about that kind of millionaire. I'm talking about the millionaire who has tens of millions of dollars. Okay? Most of the senators are worth 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 million more. Okay? A lot of the congressmen are worth, if you've been in Congress for, let's say, 12 years, so 6 terms, you're probably a multi-millionaire. Right? So that's a plutocracy. When the people who are making the laws are all multi-billionaires who are way up in the 1 and 2 percentile of the population, that's a plutocracy. And that's not even, I'm not even talking about guys like Elon Musk or Bill Gates or Zuckerman or some of those other multi-billionaires who influence politics a lot. Okay? So our country is no longer, well, there never was a democracy, but it's really not a representative democracy because these people are not like us. They don't come from our ranks anymore. And they haven't for decades, many decades, well, since the war probably. Okay? You're not going to see Farmer John, poor guy with 10 pigs and 4 milk cows becoming a senator. You're not going to see a blue-collar factory worker, or even a geek engineer at Raytheon becoming a senator or even a congressman. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen, right? Because you have to be a millionaire just to run for office, much less get elected. Okay? So, the representative democracy in our country went out the window a long time ago. 70 years, 80 years ago. And so the people who represent us really are not representing us at all because they have no idea how we really live. And they could not live the way we live for a minute. It would kill them. Okay? We need to understand that. So that's the same thing was going on in Jerusalem. Let's talk about the high priest a little bit. The high priest was the most eminent and powerful man in the nation. He was the head of both classes. So he's head of the middle class, the priests and all those guys, and he was the head of the higher class, the upper class, the luxury class. Okay? He is the only one that could enter the Holy of Holies, of course, and take part in religious services at any time. So if he wanted to, he could come in to the regular daily sacrifices and take over the service and run the service and take his portion from the sacrifices if he wanted to. In other words, imagine if we had worship service 7 days a week. Okay, and that's what they basically had in the temple. Imagine we had church here 7 days a week. We had offerings taken 7 days a week. And the pastor took 10 or 15, 20%, 25% of the offerings. Just as a regular thing. And instead of giving some of the lay people or the elders an opportunity to run the service and get that 25%, I would show up every single day and take the 25% for me. Okay, that's what it was like. All right. Most important, halfway through there, the paragraph, most important though was the fact the high priest was in charge of the 7-day regulations to assure purity before the Day of Atonement, as well as be careful for the purity of his line of descent. So here was a guy who watched the purity of the other priests like a hawk. And he was the one who determined whether or not you were good enough to serve in the temple. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, he didn't like you. He could find something that he didn't like about you, and you'd be out of a job. Also, he was only to marry a pure virgin, usually one of the priestly families. Any instance of breaking marriage laws on his part brought an outcry from the people. So he had to be very, very careful. He had to live a very outwardly good life. He couldn't even be accused of bribery. He couldn't be accused of lying. He couldn't be accused of infidelity. Now, he could have as many wives as he wanted, but he couldn't then go out and have a girlfriend too. Keep himself to his wife. And most of the time, the high priests were very picky about that, and most of them didn't have a lot of wives like the other people did. But his according to the Old Testament, the high priest was a servant till death. That was the way it was supposed to be. That's the way the Scripture is called. Samuel, as you remember, back in the Old Testament, Eli. Well, Samuel too, for that matter. But Eli served until he died. Remember, he fell off the chair because he was so fat and he died. So Samuel too served until he died. That was the way it's supposed to be, like Supreme Court justices. That's the way it's supposed to be in the Bible. Okay, the high priest will serve until he dies. Well, that changed. Herod made the office of high priest an appointed position, and thus dependent on whatever current political authority held sway at any given time. So if Herod wanted to appeal to the Romans, he picked a Roman sympathizer for high priest. If he wanted to appeal to the Pharisees, he picked a Pharisee sympathizer as high priest, and so on, and so on, and so on. Most of the high priests came from the Sadducees. Most of them. Not all of them, but most of them. At the same time, next page, we see in the Gospels a retired high priest was still quite influential, and he continued to be listed on the records as high priest. That's why, folks, in case you're interested, that's why both Caius and Annas are both called high priests in the Bible. That's not a contradiction. They both were high priests. One was the, let's say, official high priest, that is the high priest according to the rules of the Bible, and the other was the political high priest appointed by Herod to appease the Romans. Okay? So that's why we have two seemingly, even though it's a single position, single office, that's why we seemingly have two different high priests who are dealing with Jesus and all that during his passion. Sadly, there was much corruption with most of the high priests, mainly simony. Everybody remember what simony is? Simony is people paying for office, or paying for an office. It would be like a straight bribery. Let's say one of our congressmen died. No, it wouldn't happen to a congressman. It would be a senator. So let's say a senator died, and the governor appoints the senator to keep on, like we had with McCain, and he appointed somebody to keep going with McCain's term. If somebody went to the governor and said, "I'll give you $1 million if you will appoint me in McCain's seat," that's simony. Okay. Now, mostly the word simony has to do with religious positions, but it can also be used for civil positions too. Nepotism just means you get the office because you're related. Okay. So you need to have a new postmaster in Sierra Vista. The old postmaster who's retiring, he can say, maybe his nephew, let's say, is a simple postal worker, and he said, well, I'm going to appoint him as the new postmaster, and big raise and everything, much more authority and all that. And he only does that because he's his nephew. That's nepotism. Okay. The next line in power influence came from the chief priests and Levites. These were several orders of priests after the anointed high priest. There was the appointed high priest. So you had the anointed one. That was the one that came according to the Bible. Right? Then the appointed one was the one appointed by Herod, or sometimes appointed by the Romans. Romans did that too sometimes. And then the priests anointed for war, okay, and so on. There was a priest anointed for war, and a priest anointed for harvest, and a priest anointed for, we would call them civil projects, and a priest anointed for to take care of alms for the poor, and a priest. There are all kinds of bureaucratic positions. I didn't want to make a whole long list of them because it really doesn't matter. Each of them had their spot in line, so to speak. It's kind of like a cabinet, now what do we have? 18, 19 cabinet offices, something like that. Going on. Let's go to the next paragraph. The captain of the temple worked closely with the high priest and watched him for purity. So the high priest was in charge of everybody else's purity. The captain of the temple was in charge of the high priest's purity, which is why he had to be very careful about how he acted. He was the deputy. So the high priest is in charge on the Day of Atonement. The captain of the temple was like vice chairman, if you will, of the Day of Atonement. And he was also responsible for the everyday worship in the temple. As for the priests themselves, they too had a hierarchy. There was the director of the weekly course, and then the director of the daily course. The first one was above the second one in authority. So if you were the director of the weekly course, that is, you made the assignments, who was going to serve in the temple during the week. And there was another guy underneath him who decided when you're going to serve, what day and what part of the day you're going to serve. So you had a guy in charge of the weeks and a guy in charge of the days, okay? The priests had been divided into 24 courses by King David, so that each group only had to be in temple service 1 week out of 24, or roughly 2 weeks a year. So your job as a priest, you only got to be priest 2 weeks out of the year. And because there were so many of them, you were lucky if you functioned once a week at all. And that's when you would get some of the grain and some of the meat and some of the wine and some of the oil and like that come in from the sacrifices. So imagine if you only got paid 1 day a month or 2 days a year. Wow. So it's no wonder that they were poor, and it's no wonder that they all had second jobs. Right? Some were there all the time. And they hung around maybe to take people's special requests, things like that. The director of the weekly course was mostly in charge of the rites of purification of lepers and women and other physical difficulties. Okay? So if somebody came and say, I need to be purified so I can go into the actual temple and make a sacrifice, he would present himself to the director of the weeks. Weekly director of the weekly courses. Everybody would know who that was. Is either he wore a special sash maybe or something, or his name was listed somewhere. We're not sure exactly how people knew, but everybody knew who they had to appear to. Okay. The director of the daily course was responsible for the times they were to serve the people for individual sacrifices. So remember, the temple is open during daylight hours, and during that time was not just the regular temple services, but then if you had a special issue, let's say you were shaking out your blanket and you hit somebody, put out their eye, all right? And so you owed, rather than eye for an eye, there were all kinds of other rules that, rather than take your eye out, you could pay. And you would pay that person. You would also pay something to God. You would go to the temple. You would say, I did something bad. I accidentally hit this guy. And so I'm going. You see that I give him, whatever it was, half a pig or whatever. That would be a pig. Half a goat or something in payment for his eye, and then I also give the Lord something because I'm a bad person or whatever. And he would say that. And so there were individual priests that would do this individual kind of sacrifices. All right. Serve the people. Other times of the year, most priests lived in the priestly cities scattered around the country. Like Zacharias, he lived up in the hill country of Judea, or was it Benjamin? Anyway, the hill country. And once a year, he would come in, twice a year, I guess, he would come in and serve, and he would serve a very specific period of time, maybe one 4 or 5 hour shift, let's say, and 2 days a week, maybe, something like that. Now, on top of that, we got more bureaucracy. See, I want you to understand how many pencil pushers and paperclip counters we're talking about here. Okay? So far, we've got quite a few. There was also the temple overseer and the temple treasurer. There were 7 overseers that had the 7 keys of the court in their custody, and they were in charge of the external arrangements for the times they were there. So they were assigned certain times, and they were the ones to make sure the candelabra had the wicks in it and had oil in it. They were the ones that made sure that the utensils on the table of showbread were clean. They were the ones who made sure there was water in the big wash basin that animals were washed in. They made sure that the knives were sharp, okay, for cutting the throats of the animals, and so on and so on and so on and so on. The treasurer, 3 treasurers, so we had 7 overseers and 3 treasurers. The treasurer placed over financial matters, the sale of birds, lambs, goats. These would be the guys who oversaw the people with all the tables, the money changers, right? And the sellers of the birds and the animals and all that. Okay? So those people had 3 treasurers over them who saw, and they all got their cut. Okay? So right away, we've got 10 major bureaucrats. We've got 10 administrators. We've got the 7 overseers and the 3 treasurers. Okay? And then the common priests and Levites usually worked at other jobs to support themselves, as I said. The use of the label high priest is used 64 times in the Gospel and Acts. It is often in the plural. It is properly used of chief priests who were men of the court, mostly at the Sanhedrin. So when the word says high priests in plural, it's not talking about Annas and Caiaphas. It's talking about these guys. Okay? The upper echelon bureaucrats, right? You all know, for example, that it doesn't really matter who's elected president or vice president or even Speaker of the House or anything. You know, I'm sure most of you know, that the city of Washington, D.C. is run by bureaucrats. And those bureaucrats are lifetime people. They stay there no matter what. It doesn't matter. Republicans can come and go, Democrats come and go, it doesn't matter. If all we did is elect all libertarians in November, it wouldn't matter. Wouldn't matter one iota. The people who are doing all of the work behind the scenes, who are writing all of the laws, okay, the secretaries, the errand boys, the gophers, the various administrators of bureaucracies and the filers of papers and the people who run the printing office and on and on and on and on. Hundreds of thousands of people never change. When one president leaves and takes his family out of the White House, and let's say senators get defeated and Congress people, they leave, there's still a whole ton of people stay behind who are exactly the same people. Exactly the same. Okay? And you see these office buildings around Washington. This office building and that office building, and the FBI office building and the Bureau of Engraving office building and the Treasury building and this building and that building. They're just chock full of offices. There's tons of people in there. And they never change. I had a cousin who worked there. She worked actually at the Pentagon. And she was not a political appointee. She was not an election or anything like that. She was a lifetime worker. She worked basically her entire life at the Pentagon in a little cubbyhole office, filing papers, and signing things, and shuffling things from office to office, and whatever. And she made darn good money. She was able to afford a townhouse in Georgetown, and lived a very nice life. There in Washington. And those people are multitudinous. They're like the stars in the sky, folks. They're like the sands on the seashore, right? That's the way it was in Jerusalem, all right? Get that in your head.
Now it's here.
Yeah. From the time of the Exodus to 70 AD, so from 1500 BC to 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, there were 83 high priests. During the time of Christ, there were only 2 legitimate high priests, that is, those who were not merely political appointees. Anael, who was at the time of Jesus' birth, and Phinehas at the time of the destruction of the temple. There were 25 illegitimate priests under the Herodians from 4 families: family of Botus, family of Hannas, of Philobi, and Kamith. Botus was the most powerful family. But all this means is that 3 or 4 families held the power. In the gospel, Hannas, or Annas as we know him, his 5 sons, and his son-in-law Caiaphas are example of this power. So neither Annas nor Caiaphas were legitimate. They were either political appointees or they had usurped the office without proper authority. Because the office is supposed to be hereditary. But as you can see, since there were 4 families that switched around, couldn't very well be hereditary, could it? No, it couldn't. Yeah. Next paragraph. The Talmud tells us that there were up to 85,000 priests. Now, did you know that? Did you have any idea there were 85,000 priests?
Wow, they would be starving.
We're going to have those in what department?
That's from the energy department, yeah. That's 1/12 of the population of Judea at the time. Which is somewhat questionable, okay? So I'm not sure the Talmud is correct there, but maybe. The Roman historian Aristias said there were 750 priests in one course. So in one section. 750 times 24 courses equals 18,000. So I don't know what the other 60,000 were doing. Looking at the public services of the temple, we know that 50 priests served during a daily course. So in one day, in the daylight hours, 50 priests would be in that temple. Then did you know that? Did you have any idea that that's what you're dealing with? When Jesus goes to teach in the temple, he's got 50 of these guys watching his every move and writing down everything he says. Yeah, 50 of them. 350 priests a week. At least 300 priests were needed to immerse this temple curtain in water. The temple curtain was so heavy and was so large, it took 300 men to take it down and clean it. Can you imagine? Yes, ma'am.
Well, that kept it from the Holy of Holies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when it was being cleaned, you could see into the Holy of Holies?
My sources say that they had 2 curtains.
Okay.
One was hung, the other was taken down and cleaned and put away for storage and stored away. And then when the other one had to be cleaned, and I tried to find out how often they cleaned it, and I could not find out.
Yeah, I was just,
I could not find that anywhere. Also tried to find out how often did they open and shut the doors every morning and night, or did they do that or some other time? I don't know. I couldn't find that out either. Let's see. So then about 1/10 of the population were priests and Levites, when you add in the both groups, and their families, roughly 50,000 people, giving a population of 500 to 600,000 in Israel. And I should have said Judea. This calculation, however, may be a little low. Other historical estimates put the number between 750 and 850,000. So still a pretty good substantial population for Palestine, tiny little place. There were a few jobs in Jerusalem, real jobs. I mean, besides working for the government or the temple. So the priests often did manual labor at home, their priestly cities, for 10 or 11 months of the year, leaving during the time of their course, plus the festivals. Some priests served in the court, and some were scribes, but not all of them were that educated. There were many contrasts between the common priests and the aristocracy. The Levites were descendants of the priests listed in Deuteronomy, And they were involved in the temple in music and various forms of service, sometimes inferior jobs, such as humble servants, temple police, doorkeepers, and the like. All priests had to be Levites, but not all Levites were priests. So if you were a Levite, that didn't automatically give you a job as a priest. It was stipulated that the priests should take great care in tracing their own genealogies to ensure purity of their line, should be as, not at, as Levites, and thus watch the rigid rules of marriage and examining the potential wife's genealogy too. The priests were to marry only other priests' daughters, otherwise the marriages were illegitimate and really only a concubinage. In other words, their wives were not wives, they were concubines. Kind of like today. We have Camilla, being the queen consort, meaning she cannot be, if Charles would die, Camilla could not take over as queen and be queen like Queen Elizabeth was queen. Okay? So if Charles falls off a balcony tomorrow, Camilla does not become Queen of England because she's only a consort. Now, if Diana had lived, and if Diana, and they had not gotten divorced, obviously, then if Charles falls off a balcony, then that wife would become Queen of England. Well, just like Elizabeth. She would have all the rights and privileges of somebody like Elizabeth. Okay? Philip, Elizabeth's husband, was also called Prince Consort because he was not of one of the royal lines that would be recognized in England. He was from the royal line of Greece, not England.
Just to follow it.
So, and there's some argument right now as to if Charles would die and William would become king, whether Catherine, would be queen or queen consort. So far, most of the royal experts are saying that she would be regular queen. But there are a few who are saying, no. Her family line is not good enough for her to be full queen. So Charles can fix that if he wants to. Charles can say, if he wants to right now, or come out tomorrow, and he can come out tomorrow and he can say, I hereby declare that if and when I should die, my wife then becomes queen consort still, or she stays queen consort, or lady queen, or whatever like that. And then he can say, I hereby declare that Kate will become full-fledged queen. Or he can say she also would be only queen consort. He can do that. Now let's talk a little bit about the Sanhedrin, then we'll cut it off. The Great Sanhedrin, which means a sitting together, that's what that word means. When you hear that word in the Bible, it means council or sitting together, was the supreme council of the Jews who met within Jerusalem's temple at a place known as the Chamber of Hewn Stones. So when they had Jesus' trial, that's where they met. Although they sometimes met at the house of the high priest. There are some commentators who believe that's true in Jesus' case, but I frankly don't think so. But be that as it may. The Sanhedrin was like the U.S. Supreme Court in that they had the final authority on decisions that affected the religious and political lives of all the Jews. So it wasn't a Senate, it wasn't a Congress. It was more like a very large Supreme Court. The council convened each day of the week except the Sabbath and on annual biblical holy days, so on the feast days. The New Testament times, the Sanhedrin composed of 71 members, high priest as chief justice, a vice chief justice, and 69 general members. Only chief priests, elders, and scribes were eligible to sit on the council. So again, those bureaucrats I was mentioning before, the treasurers and the chiefs of courses and all that kind of stuff, those were chief priests, so those could sit on the Sanhedrin, and also elders and scribes, people like Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, and so on and so forth like that. The Sanhedrin was made up mostly of old hereditary nobility, namely priests and elders. The elders are the heads of ancient ruling families. It was a very small, closed circle. They were landowners who could supply the temple. They were men of means. In other words, they were rich. They and the chief priests were largely Sadducees, holding to a literal interpretation of the Torah and a severe penal code. They had an elaborate tradition of doctrine conservatively close to Moses. However, they saw the rest of the Old Testament as secondary and paid little attention to the writings of the prophets. All right, we'll stop there. Well, I hope it's stuff you've never heard before. Well, I hope so. The point of this is, as we get into the life and times of Jesus himself, and especially what he says to these people and how he deals with the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the scribes and the rabbis and all that kind of stuff, I hope it gives us a little better feeling for why he says what he says and why they say what they say and all that. What was the conflict between Jesus and the Jews? Why did the Jews reject Jesus so absolutely? And I'm hoping to give you some insight into that. It wasn't because they were dumb. It wasn't because they were stupid or idiots or anything like that. They had very worldly, but good worldly reasons why they objected to a lot of things Jesus said. But again, if they had thought about it a little bit, they had dug a little deeper, I think they wouldn't have come to some of the conclusions that they did. Okay? All right, you may be excused.
They want God's word from
Well, yeah. That is very true. Yes. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Very, very true.
Here he's sitting all by himself. Alone. He's not here. And you're alone, you're sitting all by yourself. The whole road to yourself. No, it wasn't.
Yes.
In the story shed of Stephen. You need help.